Ukraine has lost this war. I would argue it lost it some time ago. It's now becoming so apparent that even the most ardent supporter of Ukraine's war on Russia in London, Berlin, Paris, or the United States, and Washington can't really stand up and say anything else. I suppose some will, but the truth is the war is over. The Ukrainians are losing on a daily basis somewhere between 500 and 1,000 dead and wounded. Their army is effectively annihilated. They're throwing reservists, the equivalent of what we would call National Guardsmen, into the buzzsaw. And the Russians are very calmly, methodically annihilating whatever shows up. The Russians have already begun consolidating their control over 25, 30% of Ukraine, where the Ukrainian forces were previously paused to attack Russia. They now control territory that is responsible for roughly 80% of Ukraine's gross national product. So I expect that the Russians will hold on to this and incorporate it into Russia. It will be annexed. It was historically Russian. It is again. Now, as far as how will this end? Well, we have a lot of people that seem to be determined that it will not end. And that is extremely dangerous because the longer this lasts, the greater the potential for this regional conflict to widen and engulf more countries and ultimately to drag us in, which some people think is the real goal, incomprehensible as that may seem. If we stopped funding the Ukrainian government, everything would collapse. I'm sure Mr. Zelensky would climb into an airplane and fly to Miami, where he owns a mansion, and essentially try to duck any responsibility for what's going on. But we continue to send hundreds of millions of dollars in hard cash over there that pays everyone. Our friend President Biden is sort of a mushroom. They keep him in a dark place and feed him crap. I think Susan Rice, Jake Sullivan, Blinken, oligarchs, frankly, rich, powerful figures that control the Democratic Party, and let's face it, large portions of the Republican Party who dominate Washington, they all have much more influence now than Americans realize. They're running the show. So I think they're not telling Joe Biden anything that they don't really want him to know. But more important, they're riding this train to oblivion, and they're not going to get off, and they're throwing more coal into the locomotive with each passing day. In other words, they're doubling down on failure in the belief that if they just hang on long enough, somehow or another, miraculously, they're going to win. And they're destroying NATO. They're tearing Europe apart. Europeans are finally beginning to wake up to the disaster. They've lost control of Eastern Europe. You have the Lithuanians who want to cut the Russians off from East Prussia, or this place called Kaliningrad. You have Russian retired officers now calling for Putin to commit nuclear weapons to the defense of Kaliningrad. At the same time, you have the Poles who continue to advocate for greater violence against Russia and greater support for the non-existent Ukrainian state. Because let's face it, Ukraine is now a failed state. It's collapsed. People are being pushed at gunpoint into Russian fire. This whole thing is a disaster. But no one wants to admit failure because they know once they admit failure, they lose all credibility. Obviously, we could have paid attention to what Mr. Putin was saying and had been saying for literally a decade. I mean, this goes back to 2008 in Budapest and the Munich Security Conference, where he effectively said, we cannot accept what you're doing. We will not tolerate the presence of NATO forces, particularly U.S. forces, on our borders. We could have listened to that. There was always the opportunity to say, we don't need Ukraine. We don't need to turn Ukraine into a platform for attack against Russia. We don't need it. It's unnecessary. And Russia, whatever we don't like about it, is not the Soviet Union. We refuse to do any of those things. We refuse to consider neutrality. And remember, we also intervened once the intervention began by Putin. And frankly, I disagree with people who say, oh, Putin's evil. He started this war. No, I think we started the war. He simply acted as he did because he thought he had no choice, or he was going to end up with the equivalent of something like Pershing missiles in eastern Ukraine that would threaten and destroy Russia. So I think he did what he thought he had to do. But even after he did, he was always willing to negotiate. We kept intervening and telling Zelensky and his friends, don't give an inch. We'll support you. And perhaps they thought, I wouldn't be surprised. They may well have thought that we were coming to their rescue. And at the time, I said they're in the same position the Poles were in 1939 when Churchill and the French said, oh, we'll stand by you, Poland. Well, that didn't do the Poles any damn good. And Poland emerged from the war perhaps in the worst position of anybody. But the point is, we refused to consider anything that made sense. And no one looked at the region and said, this is a part of the world, Judge, where we don't want a war. This is more dangerous than anything else we've experienced in the last 75 years.